In 1979, on what seemed like a perfect summer evening, a 9-year-old girl's life changed forever. One moment she was watching television and laughing at a comedy show. The next, she was learning that someone wanted her entire family dead. This is the story of the Busby family, whose year of terror began with a single shotgun blast that shattered more than just a car window. It destroyed their sense of safety, their home, and forced them into a life they never imagined possible. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1979, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. The Busby family is spending their evening in the driveway, painting a car while the summer sun sets over Cape Cod. 9-year-old Silyn Busby has no idea this will be the last normal moment of her childhood. Her father, John Busby, is getting ready for his midnight shift as a police sergeant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Everything seems ordinary, peaceful even, but in small towns like Falmouth, ordinary can become extraordinary in the span of a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat stops altogether. John Busby wasn't just any police officer. He was the kind of cop who didn't care about your connections, your family name, or how much money you had. If you broke the law, you faced the consequences, period. This unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect from honest citizens and hatred from those who thought they were above the law. Unfortunately for the Busby family, one of those people had decided that John Busby needed to be silenced permanently. As John drove to work that night, less than half a mile from his house, a car pulled up behind him. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle on the road, but then it pulled alongside his Volkswagen, matching his speed. In that moment, John realized this wasn't a normal traffic situation. Someone was hunting him. The blast from the shotgun tore through the driver's side window with devastating force. The impact ripped through John's face, destroying his lower jaw and leaving him barely conscious. But in those crucial seconds before darkness took hold, he managed to do something that would save his family's lives. He wrote 2 words that would change everything, not an accident. John Busby knew instantly who wanted him dead. He'd crossed paths with dangerous people before, but one name stood out above all others. Someone who had a reputation for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. Someone who had been suspected in multiple disappearances and murders but had never been held accountable. Someone whose favorite saying was, "I smell smoke," which wasn't a comment about the weather, but a thinly veiled threat that your property might mysteriously catch fire. Meanwhile, back at the Busby house, 9-year-old Silyn was settling in for what she thought would be a normal evening. She was watching Benny Hill on television, laughing at the comedy sketches, completely unaware that her father was fighting for his life just minutes away. Her mother Polly was studying to become a nurse. Her 2 older brothers, Eric and Sean, were probably getting ready for bed. Their cousin Kelly, who helped with babysitting duties, was keeping an eye on things. Then came the knock at the door that shattered their world. When Silyn heard someone crying or screaming, she initially thought it was coming from the television. But as the sounds continued, she realized something was terribly wrong. She came out of her room to find her father's colleague, Rick Smith, in uniform, speaking to her mother who was crying and screaming, repeatedly saying no, 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 and trying to push him away. The confusion was overwhelming. Nobody was explaining what had happened. There was just chaos, fear, and the terrible realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Silyn stood there, asking what was happening. But the adults were too consumed by their own shock and panic to notice her. What Silyn didn't know yet was that her father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to breathe on his own, but very much alive and very much aware of who had tried to kill him. What she also didn't know was that this shooting wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge certain people in their small town. And if those people were willing to shoot a police officer, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to finish the job by eliminating his family. The note John managed to write in his hospital bed contained more than just the words, "Not an accident." He also wrote, "Polly and the kids are not safe." This wasn't the rambling of a man in shock. This was the clear, calculated warning of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. In Falmouth, Massachusetts, there was one person everyone knew you didn't cross. Melvin Rain was in the trash hauling business, which might sound harmless enough, but his methods of dealing with competition and problems were anything but ordinary. He was a convicted arsonist with a reputation for getting even with people by sneaking around at night and burning their property, houses, cars, businesses. If Melvin had a problem with you, something you owned might mysteriously go up in flames, but arson was just the beginning. Melvin was also suspected of murder. Not one murder, not two, but 3 separate cases where people had disappeared or turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. His own wife, Wanda, had vanished in 1971 after he claimed to have dropped her off at a bus station. She was never seen again. A teenage boy who had been dating a girl Melvin was interested in was found shot to death in a cranberry bog directly across from Melvin's house. A 17-year-old former employee who was set to testify against Melvin in a grand jury investigation got on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard but never got off. In each case, Melvin walked free. The pattern was always the same. People who crossed him or posed a threat to him seemed to disappear or meet unfortunate ends. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Or perhaps there were people in positions of power who were too afraid to go after him. This was the man John Busby had been willing to confront when others wouldn't. This was the man who had decided that a police officer who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated needed to be eliminated. And this was the man who now posed an ongoing threat to a family that included 3 young children. Back at the hospital, doctors were working frantically to save John's life. The damage was so severe that they had never seen anything like it. His face was unrecognizable. His jaw was gone, and he couldn't speak, breathe, or eat without mechanical assistance. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way for one reason: his family needed him to survive so he could protect them from what was coming next. Because this story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the Busby family tried to process what had happened, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had specifically targeted John Busby for elimination, and that same someone would likely not be satisfied with a failed attempt. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the shooting, the Busby house was surrounded by law enforcement. Squad cars filled the driveway. Officers with rifles took positions around the property. The message was clear. This family was now under siege, and everyone understood that the danger was far from over. For 9-year-old Silin, the transformation was jarring. One day, she was a normal kid living in a normal house on Cape Cod. The next day, armed guards were stationed outside her bedroom window. Police officers followed her to school, sat outside her classroom, and watched her eat lunch. Every movement was monitored. Every person who came near her was scrutinized. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and profound. At school, word spread quickly about what had happened. Some children were curious. Others were frightened. and many were simply told by their parents to stay away from the Busby kids. Silen found herself sitting alone at lunch tables, excluded from playground games, and treated like a walking target. One particularly cruel classmate even told her directly that everyone knew someone was trying to kill her family and that they might be next. The family's home became a fortress. An 8-foot fence was erected around the property. A sophisticated alarm system was installed. Windows were covered. Doors remained locked at all times. The family dog, Tiger, was given away and replaced with Max, a trained attack dog whose sole purpose was to eliminate any threat to John Busby or his family. Max wasn't a pet. He was a weapon with 4 legs and a set of teeth designed to kill. But perhaps the most unsettling change was in John himself. When he finally came home from the hospital months later, he was a different person entirely. The injuries to his face were so severe that he was barely recognizable. His jaw had been reconstructed, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man who had once been playful and affectionate with his children now seemed emotionally distant. The father who used to roughhouse and tell jokes had been replaced by someone who was constantly vigilant, always watching, always planning. The financial burden on the family was crushing. John's compensation for being shot in the line of duty was $200 per week, hardly enough to support a family of 5, let alone a family that needed round-the-clock security. The town of Falmouth was spending enormous amounts of money on police protection, and it was becoming clear that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting was going nowhere. Despite John's clear indication of who was responsible, despite the obvious motive, and despite Melvin Rain's history of violence, no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no justice was served. It was as if the shooting had never happened, at least from an official standpoint. This lack of action wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. If the police couldn't or wouldn't go after the person who had tried to murder one of their own officers, what protection could they really offer his family? The Busbys were living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next attempt on their lives might come. John's anger was building to dangerous levels. In his hospital bed, he had initially focused on survival and recovery. But as the months passed and it became clear that no official justice would be forthcoming, his thoughts turned to a different kind of solution. He began to contemplate taking matters into his own hands. The idea of hunting down Melvin Rain and finishing what had been started that night in August became more than just a fantasy. It became a plan. The family was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They couldn't live normally because of the constant threat. They couldn't rely on the justice system because it had failed them completely. They couldn't even trust their own community because too many people were either afraid of Melvin Rain or somehow connected to him. As winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, it became increasingly clear that something had to change. The Busby family couldn't continue living as prisoners in their own home. The town couldn't continue spending money on protection that might not even be effective. And John couldn't continue to heal, physically or emotionally, while surrounded by daily reminders of the violence that had been done to him. The solution, when it finally came, was as drastic as it was necessary. If the Busby family couldn't be safe in Falmouth, Massachusetts, then they would have to leave Falmouth, Massachusetts, not just for a vacation or a temporary relocation, but permanently. They would have to disappear completely, leaving behind everything they had ever known and starting over somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere that Melvin Rain couldn't find them. But leaving meant more than just packing their belongings and driving away. It meant abandoning their identities, their history, their connections to the community where they had lived their entire lives. It meant the children would have to learn to lie about their past, create false stories about why they had moved, and never speak the truth about what had happened to their father. Most importantly, it meant that John Busby would have to make a choice. He could stay and pursue the violent revenge that was consuming his thoughts, or he could prioritize his family's safety and disappear with them into whatever new life awaited them far from Cape Cod. The decision would define not just the next chapter of their story, but the rest of their lives. In the end, the choice was made for them. The town of Falmouth, faced with mounting security costs and no resolution in sight, made it clear that the easiest solution was for the Busby family to simply disappear, rather than continue the expensive protection detail or pursue justice against the person responsible. It was more convenient for everyone involved if the victims just went away. The message was unmistakable. It's easier for you to live somewhere else than to live here. We'll save money, and you'll be on your way. After everything John had sacrificed in service to his community, after taking a shotgun blast to the face in the line of duty, this was his reward. The town that he had protected was essentially telling him that his family's safety was less important than their budget. So in the summer of 1980, almost exactly 1 year after the shooting, the Busby family began their exodus from Cape Cod. They loaded their belongings into a car and started driving south, with no clear destination except somewhere safe. They had pulled the names of towns out of a hat, places where Polly might find work as a nurse, and Tennessee had won the lottery of their desperation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were given a police escort to the Bourne Bridge, the boundary that separates Cape Cod from the mainland. It was both a gesture of respect and a clear message, goodbye and good riddance. You're not our problem anymore, as they crossed that bridge, leaving behind everything they had ever known. The children understood that they weren't just moving to a new town. They were entering a witness protection program of their own design, one where they would have to reinvent themselves completely. The people they had been, the Busby family of Falmouth, Massachusetts, were disappearing forever. The drive south felt like descending into hell. As they traveled further from the familiar coastline of Cape Cod, the temperature rose and the landscape became increasingly foreign. For children who had grown up with ocean breezes and familiar neighborhoods, the rural expanses of the American South felt like exile to another planet. When they finally reached their destination in Tennessee, the culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the social customs, even the way people looked at strangers. The Busby children, with their New England sensibilities and traumatic baggage, stood out like beacons in their new community. But standing out was exactly what they couldn't afford to do. So they began the painful process of transformation. Silent got a perm and started practicing a Southern accent. She learned to apply lip gloss and dress like the local girls. Most importantly, she learned to lie about their past, about why they had moved, about what was wrong with her father's face, about everything that mattered. John grew a massive beard that obscured most of the damage to his face. He found work on a farm, spending his days splitting wood and doing physical labor that seemed to help process some of his rage. The repetitive motion of swinging an axe through logs became a form of therapy, a way to channel the violence that still simmered inside him. For a while, it seemed like the healing might actually work. The family began to find their rhythm in this new place. The constant fear that had defined their existence in Massachusetts gradually faded. The children started making friends. Polly found work as a nurse. They were still looking over their shoulders, still careful about who they trusted. But life began to feel somewhat normal again. But John's anger hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. Every few months, he would have to return to Boston for reconstructive surgery, and each trip forced him to confront what had been done to him. When he shaved his beard for these procedures, he would see the full extent of his injuries in the mirror, and the rage would come flooding back. During one of these trips, his uncle presented him with a gift, a rifle with a scope and a silencer, everything he would need to hunt down Melvin Rain and finish what had been started that night in 1979. For a moment, John was tempted. The weapon represented everything he had dreamed about during those dark months of recovery. But something had changed. The man who had once fantasized about revenge had been replaced by someone who understood that his family's peace was worth more than his personal vengeance. He looked at the gun, wrote a note to his uncle, and walked away. "Thank you for your effort," he wrote. "I won't need it." That decision marked a turning point. When John returned to Tennessee, he told his family he was done with surgery, done with trips to Boston, done with living in the past. They were going to embrace their new life and move forward as the people they had become, not the people they used to be. Years passed. The children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. The trauma never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. The family had survived not just the original attack, but the year of terror that followed and the complete upheaval of their lives. Then, in 2003, 24 years after the shooting, something unexpected happened. The Rain family had started turning on each other, fighting over money and spilling family secrets to the police. John Rain, Melvin's brother, finally came clean about what had happened that night in August 1979. The confession provided the vindication that John Busby had been seeking for more than 2 decades. His instincts had been correct. Melvin Rain had indeed been the one who ordered the hit. John Rain described how his brother had sat in the back seat of their car with a ski mask and a shotgun, waiting for the perfect moment to fire through John's window. But vindication came with a bitter irony. By the time the confession was made, the statute of limitations had expired. No charges could be filed. No justice could be served through the legal system. Melvin Rain would never face trial for attempted murder. In a way, though, justice had been served by other means. Melvin Rain was confined to a state institution, suffering from what was reported to be Pick's disease, a form of dementia that affects the brain. The man who had once terrorized an entire community was now powerless, his mind deteriorating, his capacity for violence neutralized by his own failing health. For the Busby family, the confession brought closure of a different kind. They had built new lives far from Cape Cod, lives that were fuller and richer than what they had left behind. Silen became a successful author, writing books for children and drawing on her experiences to help others understand resilience and survival. John and Polly found peace in their rural Tennessee home, surrounded by the natural beauty that had helped heal their wounds. The year they disappeared had ended, but the people they became in its aftermath had endured. They had proven that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding ways to thrive despite the worst that life can throw at you. They had learned that sometimes running away isn't cowardice. It's the bravest thing you can do to protect the people you love. Looking back, Silen would say that she couldn't imagine being anyone other than who that terrible year had made her. The trauma had touched every part of her life, but it had also given her strength, perspective, and an appreciation for safety and normalcy that most people never develop. She had lived through something that should have destroyed her family, and instead, it had ultimately made them stronger. The Busby family's story is a testament to the power of choosing life over revenge, healing over hatred, and love over fear. They disappeared from one life and created another, proving that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is simply to refuse to let them define your future. In the end, they had won, not through violence or legal justice, but through the simple act of surviving and building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The year they disappeared had become the foundation for decades of peace, love, and happiness that followed. And perhaps that's the most powerful victory of all. Shirley Seitz grew up in northern Alabama, a region known for its small churches lining the roads and the sounds of gospel music filling Sunday mornings. She was raised in a working-class, faith-driven family that valued giving over taking and encouraged living life with purpose, kindness, and passion for music. From an early age, Shirley was captivated by music and ministry. Those who knew her spoke of her as a warm, charismatic woman whose voice could inspire and comfort everyone who heard it. Her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, was more than a song to her. It was how she approached life. She embodied the qualities of an evangelist, someone who didn't just preach the word, but lived it, demonstrating compassion and service daily. Shirley not only kept her faith, but also actively participated in pastoral activities. She traveled to churches and gatherings across the region, not as a celebrity or famous singer, but as someone who connected sincerely with others. Her storytelling brought scripture to life, and her presence in the room was unforgettable. However, Shirley's life wasn't without challenges. Despite her deep faith, she experienced difficulties, particularly in her relationships. She had been married several times, enduring the heartbreak of failed relationships that ended in disappointment or disillusionment. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and never stopped believing in love. Her family admired her perseverance in always seeing the good in people, even when others did not see it. By the time Shirley met Michael Vollschlager, she was in her 50s. Her children were grown, and she had recently inherited a significant sum following the death of her previous husband, providing her with financial stability for the first time. While she wasn't looking for a fairy tale romance, she sought a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared faith. Michael entered her life with charm and confidence. A chiropractor by profession, he had practiced in Florida and claimed to have helped many through his work. Known as Dr. Mike, he projected an image of purpose and refinement that resonated with Shirley's values. He shared stories of past struggles and emphasized his Christian beliefs. To Shirley, who had always seen herself as a healer, Michael seemed like someone deserving of redemption, and she wanted to give him that chance. In the early days of their relationship, Shirley appeared happy. She and Michael married after just 3 months of courtship. However, her family, particularly her daughter and brothers, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of the relationship and Michael's financial instability, failed past relationships, and lack of a steady job. Despite their reservations, Shirley asked them to trust her judgment. After their marriage, Shirley and Michael moved into a small house in Loxley, South Alabama, on a street with the charming name Camelot. For Shirley, the name symbolized hope for a lifetime of happiness. She sought to create a peaceful life filled with prayer, music, and visits from loved ones. Shirley supported Michael financially in the beginning, covering expenses for their home, furniture, and vehicle, viewing these as acts of love rather than burdens. Despite their initial concerns, Shirley's family tried to welcome Michael. They joined the couple for meals, family celebrations, and holidays. Shirley's mother Myrtle, her daughter Sharon, and her brother Ricky stayed closely connected through frequent visits and calls. Shirley had always been the emotional anchor of the family, making each member feel valued and appreciated. Her family treasured this closeness and wanted to preserve it. Even after she remarried, Shirley was a steadfast presence in her community, continuing to lead worship services and provide spiritual guidance to those who turned to her. She was rarely seen in public without a smile, staying true to the principles that had always defined her: honesty, humility, and forgiveness. Her conversations with family were often filled with scripture and warm words of encouragement. Even during difficult moments or when she felt overwhelmed, she worked hard to shield those around her from her struggles. However, over time, the family began to notice small but noticeable changes in Shirley. Her voice, once strong and self-assured, began to waver. Her energy seemed drained, and she spoke differently about her life at home. Although she never directly criticized her husband, small comments hinted at financial pressures or emotional fatigue. True to her nature, Shirley kept most of her worries to herself, not wanting to burden others. To her family, she still seemed like a woman determined to make her relationship work. A woman holding on to faith in love, despite having gone through 4 previous marriages. She still gives her time, resources, faith, and trust to others. Yet, none of them could have foreseen the storm ahead. Even as doubt began to creep into their minds, they had no way of imagining the tragedy that would soon unfold. On the surface, Shirley and Michael appear to be an ordinary couple, living peacefully in a small town in Alabama. However, behind the closed doors, tensions were escalating, slowly at first. Then, with alarming intensity, Shirley's family began feeling uneasy after her marriage to Michael. Their concerns weren't based on mere suspicion, but on clear changes they observed. Shirley, once vibrant with joy and spiritual energy, seemed to be retreating from her old self. Her phone calls became less frequent. She stopped visiting her family as frequently, and her daughter Sharon noticed how she avoided questions about Michael and their finances. Unbeknownst to her family, Shirley had been almost entirely supporting Michael. He had no steady job or reliable source of income, yet his financial demands continued to grow. Shirley used the life insurance money from her late husband to sustain their life together, paying for their home, buying him a truck, and helping him with overdue bills. What began as generosity on Shirley's part eventually turned into an expectation, and finally, an obligation. As the financial strain increased, emotional distance followed. Michael began pressuring Shirley for more money, and while she initially resisted quietly, her unease began to show. In conversations with her daughter and mother, she cautiously shared her concerns. In a phone call, she mentioned that Michael was very upset when she brought up the bills. However, her reluctance to elaborate left her family unaware of the full extent of the trouble. The last time Shirley was seen alive was March 21, 2010. That night, during their conversation, she told her daughter Sharon that she loved her, without any urgency. The following day, she stopped answering her phone, which was unlike her. Sharon grew anxious. Her mother never went silent without reason. When Ricky, Shirley's brother, went to her house to check on her, Michael met him outside, calm and composed. Michael claimed Shirley had left with a friend for a spiritual retreat, but something felt wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet. Shirley's purse and phone were inside. Her car was still in the driveway, and Michael, while outwardly calm, showed no genuine concern. Alarmed, the family reported Shirley missing within hours. The Loxley Police Department launched an investigation. Officers searched the house, the nearby woods, and pressed Michael for answers. His story quickly unraveled. Initially, He said Shirley had gone out alone. Later, he claimed she had left with someone from church, but he couldn't name anyone or explain why her belongings had been left behind. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and investigators began digging into Michael's background. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Michael had a history of deception and exploitation. Court records revealed a string of failed relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative behavior. His past wives had accused him of fraud, emotional abuse, and even making threats. Shirley seemed to have fallen for his charm, only to end up as the latest victim in a disturbing pattern. As the investigation escalated, police used cadaver dogs to search the property. On March 24th, 3 days after Shirley vanished, the dogs led officers to a shallow grave behind her and Michael's home. Upon digging, investigators unearthed a tarp. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, lay the body of Shirley. Her face had been covered in duct tape, and her body showed signs of restraint. The autopsy concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation. This was no accident. It was intentional. The crime scene revealed a chilling story. Shirley's disappearance wasn't straightforward. She was murdered in her own home, likely on the night she last spoke with her daughter. Her body was buried just feet from the house where she had once sung gospel hymns and prayed for peace. Michael was arrested immediately. During his initial interview, he denied any involvement. He claimed ignorance, suggested someone else was responsible, and argued he was being framed. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered signs of a struggle inside the home. Blood found in the bedroom and hallway matched Shirley's. The duct tape discovered on her face was identical to a roll found in the garage. Cell phone records placed Michael near the burial site in the early morning hours following her disappearance. Further investigation revealed a motive. Shirley had recently confronted Michael about financial issues. She had begun to assert herself, talking about cutting off money and needing space. Michael, fearing the loss of his home, truck, and financial security, snapped. Police believed greed drove him. He had grown accustomed to the comforts Shirley's generosity provided. When she started resisting, he saw no way forward except to eliminate her. The arrest left the small town in shock. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with Michael now spoke to reporters. Church friends wept. Shirley, a woman known for her kindness and service, had been killed by the very man she tried to love and support. In the aftermath, more of Shirley's loved ones came forward. Some recalled seeing unexplained bruises she dismissed. Others mentioned that they had heard her say she didn't want to fight anymore, but had assumed she was referring to verbal arguments. No one had imagined it would escalate to that. The district attorney acted swiftly, assembling a case that painted Michael as calculating and manipulative. They gathered digital evidence, financial records, and statements from his former spouses. A disturbing pattern emerged: a man who used charm, faith, and emotional neediness to exploit vulnerable women, draining them financially and emotionally. In Shirley's case, the outcome was deadly. Michael's trial began in Baldwin County, Alabama, gripping the small community with disbelief and anger. Once seen smiling in family photos with Shirley, Michael now stood accused of first-degree murder. Prosecutors focused their strategy on proving intent, motive, and premeditation. Every detail, they argued, demonstrated that the crime was deliberate. The timeline was critical. Prosecutors outlined how Shirley was last heard from on March 21, 2010. Her car, purse, and phone were left behind. Michael's accounts of her disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. Detectives testified about the grave, describing it as hastily dug and shallow but deliberately hidden under a blue tarp and littered with debris. Medical experts confirmed Shirley's death resulted from asphyxiation, likely due to the duct tape wrapped around her face. Gruesome crime scene photos were shown in court, depicting Shirley's bound and wrapped body buried close to her home. The images were unbearable for her family, with some leaving the courtroom, while others silently leaned on one another for support. Financial records presented by the prosecution revealed that Shirley had been funding Michael's lifestyle, covering expenses like the mortgage and his truck. Her daughter Sharon and brother Ricky testified that Shirley had grown increasingly frustrated in the weeks before her death. She had started setting boundaries, saying no more often, and shared that she was contemplating changes in her life. Prosecutors argued that these actions triggered Michael's fear of losing his financial support, leading him to commit murder out of desperation. This case struck the core of the close-knit community, as neighbors mourned the loss of Shirley, generous, loving, and undeserving of what happened. Michael's defense team presented an alternative perspective. While they didn't dispute that Shirley was dead or that her body was discovered on Michael's property, they argued that her death wasn't premeditated. They claimed the tragedy resulted from an argument that spiraled out of control, causing Michael to act out of panic rather than calculated intent. They sought to depict him as an emotionally distraught man, overwhelmed and desperate, rather than a deliberate murderer. However, the jury also heard testimony from Michael's former spouses, which painted a vastly different and more disturbing picture. Two women described a history of manipulation in Michael's past relationships, including financial control, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. While the court carefully limited the scope of these testimonies, they underscored a consistent narrative. Michael appeared outwardly charming, but behaved very differently in private. Michael chose not to testify in his defense, leaving his legal team to rely solely on cross-examination and closing arguments to raise doubt. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming, the inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and the tragedy undeniable. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Wollschläger was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Shirley's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no peace. No ruling could reverse the events or bring Shirley back. The courtroom offered something the family had sought since her disappearance: certainty. In that moment, they knew what had happened, even if it couldn't undo their loss. In Loxley, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community, life eventually returned to its regular pace. Yet Shirley's absence left a void that could never be filled. Her death cast a long shadow over the town she had once served so faithfully. Her voice, once a source of praise and worship, lived on only in the memories of those who loved her. Shirley's family bore a layered grief. There was the pain of losing a mother, younger sister, and daughter. But there was also the agony of hindsight. They had felt uneasy about her quick marriage to Michael, worried about her silences, and ignored instincts that something was wrong. Despite all this, Shirley had never asked for help, a fact that haunted them deeply. She had always been the one others leaned on for support, for strength, and when she needed help herself, she chose to carry the burden alone. Shirley's daughter, Sharon, who used to call her mother daily, later admitted that she wished she had tried harder to visit earlier. However, her mom always gave the impression that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Sharon's words expressed a poignant pain shared by many families of victims, a mix of loss and helplessness. In the churches where Shirley once led congregations in song, Vigils were held in her memory. Beneath her photograph, candles flickered as pastors spoke of forgiveness, strength, and justice. They also stressed vigilance, warning how evil can often disguise itself with charm and kindness. Michael Wollschläger would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or appeals to undo his actions. While legal justice was served, the deeper wound, the loss of Shirley and all she brought to the world, remained unhealed. Shirley lived her life rooted in faith, believing in redemption, second chances, and the goodness of others. Ironically, it was this unwavering trust that cost her everything. But it also defined her legacy. For those who loved her, it was this light, her faith, resilience, and quiet strength that they carried forward. Looking at this tragic case that shook a college community to its core, we need to examine how a promising young nursing student's life was cut short by someone she thought she could trust. Tonight, we're diving deep into the murder of Haley Anderson, a case that would span 2 countries and raise questions about justice, obsession, and the warning signs we sometimes choose to ignore. It was March 2018 when 22-year-old Haley Anderson disappeared from her off-campus apartment near Binghamton University. What started as concern among friends quickly escalated into a nightmare that would expose the dark side of a relationship gone terribly wrong. Haley Anderson embodied everything you'd expect from a dedicated nursing student approaching graduation. Her friends described her as a free spirit with an infectious energy that drew people to her. She was the type of person who trusted everyone she met, always seeing the good in people even when others warned her to be more cautious. This trusting nature would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness. Born and raised in Westbury, New York, Haley had worked tirelessly throughout her college years to achieve her dream of becoming a nurse. By March 2018, graduation was just around the corner, and she had already secured a nursing position back home. Her mother, Karen, was planning a celebration party, excited to have her daughter close again after years of college life upstate. But Haley's plans extended far beyond that first job. She dreamed of traveling to California, buying a hippie van, and working as a traveling nurse while exploring the country. It was a plan that perfectly captured her adventurous spirit and desire for freedom. At Binghamton University, Haley had cultivated a close group of friends who became like family to her. She lived in an off-campus apartment with roommates who knew her daily routines, her habits, and most importantly, when something was wrong. Among her social circle was Kevin Ocampo, her on and off boyfriend who genuinely loved her but understood that Haley wasn't ready for a serious commitment. She had made it clear that she wanted to experience freedom after graduation before settling down with anyone. It was through Kevin that Haley first encountered Orlando Tercero, a fellow nursing student who would eventually become the center of this tragic story. Orlando was born in Miami but raised in Nicaragua, coming from a well-to-do family with medical connections. His father was a physician, which likely influenced Orlando's decision to pursue nursing. By all accounts, he was a good student who worked hard during the week and enjoyed socializing on weekends. The initial meeting between Haley and Orlando happened in their nursing classes, but they didn't really connect until a party at Kevin's apartment during Haley's 4th year. Orlando and Kevin bonded over their shared Hispanic background and ability to speak Spanish, leading Kevin to invite Orlando to join his fraternity. What began as a friendship between the 3 of them gradually shifted into something more complicated. When Haley and Kevin took one of their breaks, Orlando crossed a line by pursuing Haley romantically. This created tension within their friend group, especially when Orlando's fraternity brothers pushed him out for getting involved with Kevin's girlfriend. The relationship between Haley and Orlando developed into its own on and off dynamic, Friends described their interactions as volatile, ranging from hysterical laughter to heated arguments. Sometimes they would avoid each other for weeks. Other times, Orlando would be staying over at Haley's apartment. But according to those closest to the situation, Haley had been crystal clear from the beginning that she didn't want a committed relationship with Orlando. She was focused on finishing school and maintaining her independence. Orlando, however, seemed to have different ideas about where their relationship was heading. Haley's roommate Josie began noticing concerning behavior from Orlando. He would show up at their apartment uninvited, sometimes just to smoke a cigarette on their porch. He would drive by their house repeatedly, and Josie often found herself in the position of having to ask him to leave because Haley found it difficult to be direct with him herself. The red flags became impossible to ignore when jealousy entered the picture. Orlando clearly struggled with the fact that Haley was seeing other people and maintaining her relationship with Kevin. His possessive behavior began escalating in ways that should have been warning signs to everyone involved. Friends described Orlando as charismatic and fun to be around, someone who knew how to make people laugh and enjoy themselves. But beneath that charm was a growing obsession with Haley that became more apparent as time went on. The situation reached a disturbing turning point when Haley's tires were slashed. It happened the day after a party at Orlando's apartment, where he learned that Haley and Kevin were back together. When Haley walked Kevin out to his car the next morning, they discovered the damage. Kevin immediately suspected Orlando, and so did Haley's mother Karen when she heard about the incident. The damage was significant, over $600 worth, which would have made it a felony charge. Despite pressure from her family to file a police report and press charges, Haley refused. She was concerned that a felony conviction would get Orlando kicked out of the nursing program. This decision perfectly illustrated Haley's compassionate nature, but it also demonstrated how Orlando had manipulated her feelings of guilt and sympathy. Friends later revealed that Orlando would often make statements about wanting to harm himself, using emotional manipulation to keep Haley involved in his life even when she tried to distance herself. Despite the tire-slashing incident and the warnings from friends and family, Haley eventually allowed Orlando back into her life. Her trusting nature and genuine care for others made it difficult for her to completely cut ties with someone she had once cared about. The months following the tire incident were marked by this same pattern of Orlando's concerning behavior, followed by Haley's reluctant forgiveness. Her friends watched with growing alarm as the cycle continued, but Haley remained convinced that she could handle the situation. None of them could have predicted how deadly that situation would become. As March 2018 arrived, Haley was focused on her final semester and upcoming graduation. She had been spending time with her roommates, enjoying normal college activities like playing board games and sharing wine on quiet evenings. These were the moments that would later take on profound significance as the last peaceful memories her friends had of her. On the evening of March 7th, Haley had what would be her final normal night with her roommates. They stayed up late together, talking and laughing as college friends do. When they went to bed that night, none of them realized it would be the last time they would see Haley alive. The next morning brought an eerie silence that her roommates initially dismissed. Haley loved to sleep in, so when she didn't respond to text messages right away, no one was immediately concerned. College students often have irregular schedules, and it wasn't unusual for someone to be unreachable for a few hours. But as March 8th wore on with no word from Haley, that initial lack of concern began transforming into genuine worry. By Thursday, March 8th, when Haley failed to show up at poetry night, where she had promised to watch her friend perform, the concern among her circle intensified dramatically. Multiple attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, which was completely out of character for someone who stayed in constant communication with her friends and family. Her roommates began piecing together the timeline of the previous evening, trying to understand when they had last seen or heard from Haley. The realization that she had been missing for over 24 hours without any contact sent alarm bells ringing through their tight-knit group. Meanwhile, back in Westbury, Karen Anderson remained unaware that anything was wrong. She and Haley had an agreement that they would talk every Sunday, respecting her daughter's independence while maintaining their close relationship. It was still early in the week, so Karen had no reason to suspect that her daughter was in danger. The breakthrough in locating Haley came through modern technology and the quick thinking of her roommates. One of them remembered that Haley had shared her location through the Find My Friends app on her phone. When they checked the app, it showed that Haley's phone was at Orlando's apartment. This discovery shifted the search from a general missing person case to a focused investigation at a specific location. The roommates made the decision to go to Orlando's apartment and see if they could find their friend. When they arrived at the house where Orlando lived, they knocked on all the doors, but received no response. Orlando's car was also missing from the property, which seemed to confirm that no one was home. However, the fact that Haley's phone was showing as being inside the apartment created an urgent need to investigate further. Faced with locked doors and growing fear for their friend's safety, the roommates made the difficult decision to climb through a window to gain entry to the apartment. This wasn't a decision they made lightly, but their concern for Haley outweighed their reservations about entering someone else's home without permission. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The roommate who entered first immediately screamed for the others to call 911. In Orlando's bedroom, they found Haley's lifeless body. She appeared pale and motionless, and even though they hoped against hope that she might still be alive, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The police response was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes of the 911 call, the house was swarming with officers, investigators, and medical personnel. The scene quickly transformed from a college rental house into an active crime scene. Initial examination revealed that Haley had been strangled to death. The position of her body and the condition of the room suggested that the attack had been intimate and personal. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery, pointing towards someone she knew and trusted. Most significantly, Orlando was nowhere to be found. As investigators began processing the crime scene, they discovered a wealth of evidence that would help them piece together the timeline of events. The house was equipped with multiple security cameras that had captured movements both inside and outside the property. The camera footage revealed a chilling sequence of events that began in the early morning hours of March 8th. The first significant recording showed Haley and Orlando walking into the residence together. This would be the last time Haley was seen alive on any recording. After entering the apartment with Haley, Orlando was captured on camera leaving the residence multiple times over the following hours. However, Haley never appeared on any subsequent footage, suggesting that she never left the apartment after their initial arrival together. The timeline established by the security cameras painted a disturbing picture of Orlando's activities in the hours following Haley's death. Rather than immediately calling for help or reporting what had happened, he appeared to be methodically planning his next moves. Investigators tracked Orlando's movements through various pieces of evidence found in his apartment. A receipt led them to a local pharmacy where security footage showed him purchasing sleeping aids, including Zizquil and melatonin. This purchase occurred several hours after Haley's estimated time of death, suggesting he was attempting to cope with what he had done or prepare for his own suicide. The evidence suggested that Orlando returned to his apartment after the pharmacy visit and remained there for approximately 7 more hours. During this time, investigators believe he attempted to take his own life by hanging himself in the basement of the house. Physical evidence supported this theory. Officers found blood on the basement floor and a tie hanging from a doorway, along with hooks that could have been used in a suicide attempt. It appeared that Orlando had tried to hang himself but had fallen and injured himself in the process, explaining the blood evidence. Perhaps most damning was a handwritten note found in the apartment, written in Spanish. The note began with "Lamento mucho esto," which translates to "I'm really sorry about this." Orlando continued by writing that he never felt he could be capable of doing such a thing, and ended with "Father, I'll see you soon," a reference to his deceased father. This note served as both a confession and what appeared to be a suicide note, providing investigators with clear evidence of Orlando's guilt and his mental state following the crime. However, instead of following through with his apparent suicide plan, Orlando made a different choice. Approximately 16 hours before Haley's body was discovered by her roommates, security cameras captured Orlando leaving his apartment one final time, this time carrying luggage, with his head bandaged, likely from his failed suicide attempt. Orlando drove more than 3 hours to New York's JFK Airport. There, he boarded a plane that would take him back to his home country of Nicaragua, where he held dual citizenship. This flight represented Orlando's attempt to escape justice by fleeing to a country where extradition would prove complicated. His dual citizenship status meant that Nicaragua was not required to send him back to the United States to face charges, creating a potential legal nightmare for prosecutors. When District Attorney Steve Cornwell learned that Orlando had successfully fled to Nicaragua before they could arrest him, his first thought was the devastating possibility that a killer might have escaped justice permanently. The complexities of international law and extradition treaties meant that bringing Orlando back to face trial would be far from guaranteed. The case now required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, international cooperation, and navigation of complex legal frameworks that many local prosecutors rarely encounter. What had begun as a local murder investigation was about to become an international pursuit of justice. Meanwhile, the devastating news of Haley's death reached her family in the most heartbreaking way possible. Karen Anderson was at home when she noticed two men in a black car parked outside her house. When they approached her door and asked to speak with her, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The officers sat her down and delivered the news that no parent ever wants to hear. They told her that Haley had been found dead, that she had been strangled, and that the primary suspect had fled the country. In that moment, Karen's world completely collapsed. The guilt and regret hit her immediately. She remembered the tire slashing incident and her insistence that Haley should have pressed charges against Orlando. She wondered if her daughter would still be alive if they had taken that threat more seriously, if they had recognized the warning signs for what they truly were. The international hunt for Orlando Tercero intensified as Nicaraguan authorities worked to locate the fugitive. Within days of his flight from New York, Orlando was tracked to his hometown of Chinandega, Nicaragua, where he had been hiding with family members. The political climate in Nicaragua complicated matters, but eventually, local police apprehended him at a hospital where he was receiving treatment for his self-inflicted injuries. A dramatic press conference in Managua showcased Orlando in custody, confirming to the world that he had been captured. However, capturing him was only the beginning of what would become a prolonged legal battle spanning two countries and two very different justice systems. District Attorney Cornwell initially pushed for extradition, hoping to bring Orlando back to New York to face second-degree murder charges. For over a year, diplomatic channels worked to secure his return, but the dual citizenship issue proved insurmountable. Nicaragua's constitution prohibited extraditing its own citizens, regardless of existing treaties with the United States. In September 2019, Cornwell received the call that would change everything. The Department of Justice delivered mixed news. Nicaragua would not extradite Orlando, but they were willing to prosecute him under their own legal system. While this wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for, it represented Haley's family's only chance at seeing some form of justice. The charges in Nicaragua were different from what Orlando would have faced in New York. Instead of second-degree murder, he was charged with femicide, a specific crime recognizing the murder of women by men with whom they had relationships. This charge carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. What followed was an unprecedented legal proceeding that would test the limits of international cooperation. The entire trial was conducted through video conferencing, with witnesses testifying from the Broome County District Attorney's Office to a courtroom in Managua, thousands of miles away. Karen Anderson became the first witness, finally coming face to face with her daughter's killer through a computer screen. The technology allowed her to see Orlando's reaction as she testified about the warning signs they had all witnessed, his possessive behavior, and the devastating impact of losing Haley. One by one, Haley's friends and roommates shared their stories with the Nicaraguan court. They described Orlando's obsessive behavior, the tire-slashing incident, and his pattern of showing up uninvited at their apartment. The surveillance footage from Orlando's house was presented as evidence, showing the timeline of events that led to Haley's death. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly crucial, establishing that Haley had died from strangulation, with specific injuries consistent with manual compression of her neck. The intimate nature of the attack reinforced the prosecution's argument that this was a crime of passion committed by someone Haley knew and trusted. Orlando's defense team argued that he had been temporarily insane at the time of the murder, claiming he had no memory of the events due to alcohol consumption. They brought in a court-appointed psychiatrist who testified that Orlando claimed to have woken up after a night of heavy drinking to find Haley dead. However, this defense strategy fell apart under scrutiny. There was no evidence that Orlando had been intoxicated to the point of temporary insanity, and the deliberate nature of his actions afterwards suggested clear thinking and planning. The handwritten note he left behind demonstrated his awareness of what he had done. The trial moved swiftly by Nicaraguan standards, concluding after just a few days of testimony. When the judge returned from deliberation after only 90 minutes, everyone was surprised by the speed of the decision. The verdict was unequivocal guilty of femicide. In her sentencing remarks, the judge delivered a powerful statement about violence against women and the importance of recognizing femicide as a serious crime. She noted that Orlando had taken it upon himself to punish Haley for rejecting him, attempting to control her through the ultimate act of violence. Orlando received the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison, a decision that brought some measure of closure to Haley's family and friends. While nothing could bring Haley back, seeing her killer held accountable provided a sense that justice had been served. The case established important precedents for international cooperation in domestic violence cases and highlighted the serious nature of femicide as a distinct crime. It also demonstrated how modern technology, from security cameras to phone tracking apps, can provide crucial evidence in solving murders. For Haley's family, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter in their grief journey, but the beginning of another focused on healing and honoring her memory. They established initiatives to raise awareness about domestic violence warning signs and the importance of taking threats seriously. Karen Anderson became an advocate for femicide legislation in the United States, hoping that Haley's story might help prevent similar tragedies. She spoke openly about the guilt she carried for not pushing harder for charges after the tire-slashing incident, hoping other families might learn from their experience. The friends who discovered Haley's body continue to carry the trauma of that day. but they also carry forward her memory through their own nursing careers and advocacy work. They remember her as the free-spirited, trusting person who saw good in everyone, even when that trust ultimately betrayed her. Orlando remains imprisoned in Nicaragua's overcrowded penitentiary system, where he will likely spend the next 3 decades. If he ever attempts to return to American soil, he still faces second-degree murder charges in New York State, ensuring that his debt to justice extends far beyond his current sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence warning signs should never be ignored. That obsessive behavior can escalate to deadly violence, and that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones who pose the greatest danger. Haley Anderson's story is ultimately one of a bright future stolen by someone who couldn't accept that love cannot be forced or controlled. Her legacy lives on through the lives she would have saved as a nurse, the awareness her case has raised about femicide, and the determination of those who loved her to ensure that her death has meaning beyond the senseless act that ended her life. Quiet military town along California's coast, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Louise Day simply vanished without a trace. But this wasn't your typical missing person case. For over 20 years, nobody even knew she was gone. The year was 1981. Ronald Reagan had just become president. MTV launched its first broadcast, and in the small town of Seaside, California, a young girl was about to disappear from existence entirely. Not just physically, but from all records, all memories, all traces of her life. What makes Mary Day's case so haunting isn't just that she vanished. It's that her own family never reported her missing. They never called the police, never filed a report, never even told the neighbors. For 2 decades, it was as if Mary Louise Day had never existed at all. This story begins not in 1981, but in 2002, when a woman named Sherry Calgaro walked into the Seaside Police Department with a question that would unravel one of the strangest missing person cases in California history. Sherry was looking for her sister Mary, who had disappeared when Sherry was just 10 years old. Detective Joe Bertina took the case, expecting it to be routine. Missing persons cases from the 80s were challenging but not impossible. What he discovered instead was something far more disturbing. There was no record of Mary Louise Day anywhere. No social security activity, no driver's license, no credit cards, no employment records, nothing. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence. But the real mystery wasn't just where Mary had gone. It was why her own mother and stepfather had never bothered to look for her. The Day family had never been stable. Mary, along with her sisters Kathy and Sherry, had bounced between foster homes throughout their childhood. Their mother, Charlotte, struggled to care for them, and the girls were frequently separated. Eventually, Charlotte married William Hoole, a military man stationed at Fort Ord, and the family seemed to settle into a more permanent arrangement. But underneath the surface of this military family, something dark was brewing. Sherry remembered visiting her birth family years after Mary's disappearance, eager to reconnect with her sisters. When she asked about Mary, the response was chilling. Her sister Kathy pulled her aside and whispered urgently, telling her they weren't allowed to talk about Mary. The family had been instructed never to mention her name again. According to Sherry and Kathy, their parents had simply told them that Mary had run away. But running away was one thing. Never being reported missing was quite another. Detective Bertina began piecing together Mary's final days through interviews with her surviving family members. What emerged was a picture of an increasingly volatile household, where Mary seemed to be bearing the brunt of her stepfather's anger. The last time anyone remembered seeing Mary alive was during what appeared to be an ordinary evening at the family's home in Seaside. The family had gone out, leaving Mary and young Kathy at home alone. When they returned, they discovered their dog was sick and dying in the kitchen. William Hoole immediately accused Mary of poisoning the animal. According to Kathy's recollection, he flew into a rage, striking Mary so hard that blood ran from her mouth. That was the last time Kathy saw her sister alive. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to William and Charlotte, Mary simply ran away sometime during the night. They claimed she had done it before, so they weren't particularly concerned. But there were details that didn't add up. If Mary was a habitual runaway, why did William and Charlotte panic when they first discovered she was gone? Why did they never file a police report? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did they continue collecting Mary's Social Security benefits long after she disappeared? As Detective Bertana dug deeper into the case, he discovered that the family had been receiving monthly checks due to Mary's biological father's death in an accident. These payments continued for years after Mary vanished, suggesting that her disappearance might have been financially motivated. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Bertana decided to search the family's former home in Seaside. He brought Kathy along, hoping her childhood memories might provide clues about what had happened to her sister. Kathy led detectives to a specific area of the backyard, where she remembered being forbidden to play. According to her recollection, William had explicitly told the children to stay away from one particular corner of the yard after Mary disappeared. When cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property, they immediately alerted to that exact spot. The handlers were confident that human remains had been buried there at some point. Investigators began digging, their hearts pounding as they imagined finally finding Mary's body. Instead, they found something else entirely. A small child's shoe, buried in the dirt where the dogs had indicated the presence of human remains. But there was no body. The dog handlers were puzzled but certain. Their animals didn't make mistakes like this. If they had alerted to human remains, then human remains had definitely been there. The only explanation was that the body had been moved. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a potential homicide. Detective Bertana was now convinced that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that her body had been buried in the family's backyard before being relocated to an unknown location. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The family's refusal to report Mary missing, their continued collection of her Social Security benefits, the forbidden area of the backyard, and the cadaver dog's alert all painted a picture of a cover-up that had lasted more than 20 years. But just as the case seemed to be building toward arrests, something completely unexpected happened. Something that would throw the entire investigation into chaos and leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about Mary Louise Day. In November 2003, police in Phoenix, Arizona, made a routine traffic stop. The vehicle had stolen plates, and when officers ran identification checks on the passengers, one name jumped out at them immediately. The woman sitting in that truck claimed to be Mary Louise Day. The news from Phoenix hit Detective Bertana like a lightning bolt. After months of building a murder case, after bringing in cadaver dogs and digging up backyards, after interviewing family members who seemed to be hiding a terrible secret, a woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day had just materialized 700 miles away. But the timing was more than suspicious. This woman had obtained her Arizona identification card just 3 weeks earlier, right in the middle of the active homicide investigation. It was as if someone had been watching the case unfold and decided to take action. When Bertana flew to Phoenix to meet this mysterious woman, he found someone who looked like she could be Mary Day. She was the right age, had similar features, and seemed to know basic details about the family. But something felt off about her story. The woman, who Bertana began calling Phoenix Mary in his reports, claimed she had run away from home as a teenager and had been living under the radar ever since. She said she had survived by using fake names and staying off the grid, which would explain why there were no official records of her existence for over 20 years. But when Bertina pressed her for details about that final night in Seaside, her memories seemed foggy and inconsistent. She remembered some kind of confrontation with William, and she recalled bleeding. But she couldn't remember anything about the sick dog that Kathy had described in such vivid detail. This was troubling to investigators. The dog incident was central to Kathy's account of Mary's final hours. If this woman was really Mary, how could she forget such a traumatic event? Phoenix Mary seemed increasingly frustrated with the questioning. During one phone conversation, she challenged the detective directly, asking how he would be able to prove who she was even if he found her body. It was an odd thing to say, and it only deepened Bertina's suspicions. The detective was convinced this woman was an imposter, but he needed proof. The solution was simple enough: a DNA test that would definitively determine whether she was Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. Bertina was confident the test would expose the deception. There was no way this woman's DNA would match Charlotte's. Except it did. The results came back positive. Phoenix Mary was indeed Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. The case was officially closed, and after more than 20 years, Mary Louise Day had apparently been found alive. But for many people involved in the investigation, the DNA results only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Sherry Calgaro, eager to reconnect with her long-lost sister, invited Phoenix Mary to move in with her. Finally, after decades of wondering what had happened to Mary, the family could be reunited. Yet, almost immediately, Sherry began noticing things that didn't seem right. The woman claiming to be her sister spoke with a pronounced Southern accent, which seemed strange considering Mary had spent her childhood moving between California and various military bases. Phoenix Mary also claimed she had abandoned her real name years ago and had been going by Monica Devereaux. Sherry found magazines in the house addressed to this name, which seemed to support the story. But there were other details that bothered her. The woman didn't remember their father's inheritance, money that all the Day children were supposed to collect when they turned 18. This had been their shared dream as children, their ticket to freedom from the troubled household. How could Mary have forgotten something so important? Even more unsettling, she didn't remember the secret code word that she and Sherry had shared as children. They had called it Mohawk, and it was supposed to be their special signal if they ever needed to find each other again. Kathy, Mary's other sister, had an even stronger reaction when she met Phoenix Mary. Her gut instinct told her immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't the sister she remembered. The situation became even more bizarre when Phoenix Mary sent an email to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity. She seemed to be suggesting that she wasn't really Mary Day after all. Despite these red flags, the case remained officially closed. The DNA evidence was considered conclusive, and there didn't seem to be any compelling reason to reopen the investigation. But the story was far from over. In 2008, Steve Cercone, now Seaside's police chief, received another unexpected phone call. Investigators at Fort Ord, the former military base where the Hoole family had lived, were conducting an unrelated search with cadaver dogs when they made a startling discovery. The dogs had alerted to another location where the Hoole family had lived, a house they had moved to shortly after Mary's disappearance. Once again, the dogs indicated that human remains had been present at the site. This suggested something even more disturbing than investigators had previously imagined. Had Mary's body been moved not once, but twice were the Hooles systematically relocating evidence as they moved from base to base. Cercone felt compelled to reopen the investigation, even though the case had been officially closed. Too many questions remained unanswered. He hired Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective from nearby Salinas, to take a fresh look at all the evidence. Clark's review of the case files convinced him that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that Phoenix Mary was an elaborate imposter. He developed a theory that seemed to explain all the inconsistencies, though he admitted it was somewhat far-fetched. Clark believed that Charlotte Houle had given birth to another daughter years before Mary, a child she had given up for adoption and kept secret from the rest of the family. When the murder investigation began heating up in 2003, Clark theorized William and Charlotte had reached out to this secret daughter and convinced her to assume Mary's identity. The motive, according to Clark, was the inheritance money that Mary would have been entitled to collect. By that time, with accumulated interest, the sum had grown to approximately $60,000. This theory would explain Phoenix Mary's southern accent if she had been raised in a different part of the country. It would explain why she didn't remember family secrets or important details from Mary's childhood. And it would explain the convenient timing of her appearance, just as the murder investigation was gaining momentum. Clark also pointed to William Houle's own words during his police interview. The stepfather had come tantalizingly close to confessing, saying that while he hadn't killed Mary, the demon inside him might have done it. In Clark's opinion, this was as close to an admission of guilt as they were likely to get. The retired detective believed that William and Charlotte had torn up Mary's pictures, thrown away her clothes, and told their other children never to speak her name again because they were covering up a murder. The fact that they had continued collecting her Social Security benefits for years only strengthened his conviction that this was a premeditated crime. But Clark's theory, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. He had no concrete proof that Phoenix Mary was an imposter, and the DNA evidence seemed to contradict his hypothesis. The case remained in limbo, officially closed, but unofficially still generating doubts and questions among those who had worked on it. In 2017, a new detective took charge of the Mary Day case. Detective Judy Veloz approached the investigation with fresh eyes and a determination to separate fact from speculation. She wasn't interested in theories or hunches. She wanted hard evidence. Veloz began by re-examining the physical evidence that had convinced so many people that a murder had taken place. That child's shoe found in the backyard, for instance. When she held it in her palm, she realized it was extremely small, far too small for a 13-year-old girl of Mary's height and build. The shoe that had seemed like such damning evidence suddenly appeared to be nothing more than a coincidence. She also took a closer look at the DNA results that had closed the case in 2003. Additional testing had been conducted over the years, and the results were consistent. Phoenix Mary's DNA matched not only Charlotte Houle, but also Mary's biological father. The genetic evidence was overwhelming. But Veloz wanted to hear from Mary herself. The woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day was now living in Missouri, battling late-stage cancer. Her health was failing rapidly, and Veloz knew this might be her last chance to get answers. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and what Veloz heard convinced her that this was indeed the real Mary Day. The woman was able to fill in gaps in her story that had previously seemed suspicious. She explained that she had started calling herself Monica shortly after running away because she didn't want police to track her down and return her to William and Charlotte. Mary also introduced Veloz to a crucial figure from her past, a woman named Maury Kimmel, who had taken Mary in when she was just 15 years old. Kimmel remembered Mary as naive and childlike, someone who had clearly been through trauma but was trying to survive on her own. Kimmel's testimony helped explain many of the inconsistencies that had fueled the imposter theories. Mary had lived with Kimmel's family for about a year, one of the few stable periods in her adult life. But one day, she simply disappeared again, leaving Kimmel heartbroken and wondering what had happened to the young woman she had tried to help. The investigation revealed that Mary had spent decades moving from city to city, living on the margins of society and struggling with alcoholism. This transient lifestyle explained why there were so few official records of her existence. She had deliberately avoided creating a paper trail that might lead authorities back to her childhood home. Velaz also solved the mystery of why Mary had suddenly obtained that Arizona identification card in 2003. She had needed surgery to remove her gallbladder and required state assistance to pay for the procedure. A local nonprofit organization had helped her track down her birth certificate so she could get proper identification in her real name. The Southern accent that had bothered so many people also had a logical explanation. Mary had spent time in various parts of the country during her decades of wandering, and speech patterns can change over time, especially for someone who had been drinking heavily for years. As for that mysterious email Mary had sent to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity, Velaz discovered that Mary had sent a follow-up message trying to clarify her meaning. She explained that she had been confused and wasn't sure what she was trying to say in the original email. This was consistent with someone struggling with severe alcoholism and the cognitive effects of long-term substance abuse. The smoking gun in Velaz's investigation came from an unexpected source. One of Maury Kimmel's relatives had kept a photograph of Mary taken at least a year after her alleged murder in 1981. This picture clearly showed Mary as a teenager, alive and well, long after she was supposed to have been killed. Velaz submitted this photograph to TrueFace, a state-of-the-art facial recognition company. Their algorithms compared the teenage Mary in the photograph with later pictures of Phoenix Mary, and the results were conclusive. There was a 99% probability that they were the same person. With this evidence in hand, Velaz submitted her final report and officially closed the Mary Day investigation for good. After decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, the case was finally resolved. Mary Louise Day had not been murdered in 1981. She had run away from an abusive home and spent the rest of her life trying to survive on her own terms. 9 days after Velaz interviewed her, Mary Day died from cancer. There was no funeral. The woman who had been at the center of one of California's most bizarre missing person cases passed away quietly. Her story finally told, but even with the case officially closed, some people remained unconvinced. Mark Clark, the retired detective who had developed the imposter theory, admitted that Velaz's report made him question his own investigation, but he couldn't entirely shake his suspicions. Steve Cercone, the former police chief, also found himself leaning toward accepting that Phoenix Mary was indeed the real Mary Louise Day after seeing the photographic evidence. But he remained certain that the cadaver dogs had detected something significant at both burial sites. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened in the Houle household in 1981. The cadaver dogs don't lie, as their handlers repeatedly insisted. They detected human remains at 2 separate locations where the family had lived. But whose remains were they detecting? Perhaps William Houle was responsible for another death that was never reported. Perhaps there were other victims whose stories have never been told. Or perhaps the dogs were detecting very old remains that had nothing to do with the Houle family at all. What we do know is that Mary Louise Day survived her childhood ordeal and lived for 36 more years after supposedly being murdered. She never had an easy life, but she managed to survive on her own terms, far from the people who had failed to protect her as a child. The Mary Day case serves as a stark reminder of how the system can fail vulnerable children. Mary was bounced between foster homes, returned to an abusive household, and disappeared without anyone in authority noticing or caring. For 20 years, Not a single official asked where she had gone. It also demonstrates how conspiracy theories can take on a life of their own, especially when they seem to explain mysterious circumstances. The imposter theory was compelling because it accounted for so many odd details, but ultimately it was wrong. In the end, Mary Louise Day's story is not one of murder and cover-up, but of survival against overwhelming odds. A 13-year-old girl found the courage to escape an impossible situation and built a life for herself, however difficult and imperfect it may have been. She deserved better from the adults who were supposed to care for her. She deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. But she found a way to survive, and that survival was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The mystery of what happened to Mary Day has finally been solved. She lived, she struggled, and she endured. And maybe, in its own way, that's the most important truth of all. When Americans think of tropical paradise, they picture crystal clear waters, swaying palm trees, and endless possibilities for a fresh start. But sometimes what looks like paradise on the surface can hide something much darker underneath. Today, we're diving into a case that shocked investigators across 2 countries and revealed just how far someone will go to cover up the truth. This is the story of Devil's Island, where the American dream turned into an unimaginable nightmare. In the autumn of 2011, a young American couple arrived on the remote Caribbean islands of Panama with hopes of starting their new life together. Yvonne Baldelli, recently divorced and looking for adventure, had fallen head over heels for Brian Bermager, a decorated former Marine who seemed to have everything going for him. Brian had served 7 years in the Marine Corps, stationed in Washington, D.C., as part of the Honor Guard. There were even photographs of him standing in the White House alongside President George W. Bush. From the outside looking in, this guy had the perfect all-American persona that would make any woman's heart skip a beat. After completing his military service, Brian decided he needed to decompress and find his next chapter. Panama seemed like the ideal place to do exactly that. The cost of living was incredibly low, the beaches were pristine, and for someone with musical aspirations like Brian, the local bar scene offered plenty of opportunities to perform. Yvonne was absolutely smitten with this man. She saw him as her Prince Charming, the person she'd been waiting for her entire life. When Brian suggested they pack up everything and move to Panama together, she didn't hesitate for a second. Michelle Valenzuela, Yvonne's sister, watched as her sibling threw herself completely into this relationship. Yvonne was the type of person who gave 100% of herself when she fell in love, and she expected that same level of commitment in return. But Michelle had her reservations about Brian from the very beginning, despite her concerns. Yvonne was determined to make this work. She brought 2 sewing machines with her to Panama, planning to start a clothing business making bathing suits for tourists. With her beloved dog, Georgia May, by her side, she was ready to build the life she'd always dreamed of. The couple settled on Isla Carnero in Bocas del Toro, a small island community where expats from around the world came to escape their old lives. They rented a house right on the water, and Brian quickly became a fixture at the local bars, playing guitar and singing for food and drinks. At first, everything seemed perfect. Yvonne sent regular emails home to her family, painting a picture of tropical bliss. She described their morning runs on the beach, swimming in the crystal clear ocean, and the excitement of building something new together in paradise. The local expat community welcomed them with open arms. Bar owners let Brian perform in exchange for meals and free alcohol. Yvonne seemed genuinely happy, and to anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a couple living their best life. But beneath the surface, cracks were already starting to show. Brian's drinking was becoming more and more problematic. What started as a few beers after performances turned into heavy drinking sessions that lasted well into the night. Some locals noticed that his musical abilities seemed to deteriorate the more he drank, describing his intoxicated singing voice as resembling a hound dog on a porch. More concerning were the signs of trouble in paradise that some observant neighbors began to notice. There were reports of loud arguments coming from their house, and on at least one occasion, locals saw bruises on Yvonne's face that she tried desperately to hide. Despite these warning signs, Yvonne's family back in the United States remained optimistic about the relationship. Her emails continued to arrive regularly, filled with stories of their tropical adventures. Her father, Jim Faust, could picture every detail of their new life based on her vivid descriptions. He genuinely believed that Brian might be the one for his daughter. But then, around Thanksgiving 2011, something changed. The frequent, cheerful emails from Yvonne began to slow down. Michelle noticed immediately that the communication pattern had shifted, and her sisterly instincts started kicking in. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Yvonne. Finally, on December 14th, Michelle received a text message from an unknown number. It wasn't from Yvonne at all, but from Brian, asking to make arrangements to pick up his truck that he'd left at Michelle's house in California. When Michelle called the number, Brian calmly explained that he and Yvonne were no longer together. He claimed they'd gotten into a fight because she'd discovered he had a child from a previous relationship, something he'd never mentioned before. According to Brian, Yvonne had simply packed up and left without a word. This revelation was devastating for Yvonne, who was unable to have children due to a medical condition. Learning that the man she'd sacrificed everything for had been hiding the existence of his own child would have been absolutely earth-shattering. But Michelle wasn't buying Brian's story. When she suggested they go to the police together to file a missing persons report, since he was the last person to see Yvonne, Brian seemed reluctant to get involved. That's when Michelle decided to dig deeper into her email account, where she discovered a message she'd previously overlooked. It was from Yvonne herself, sent shortly after Brian's call, explaining that she and Brian had broken up and that she was headed to Costa Rica with a man she'd met when they first arrived in Panama. The email described Brian as a lying, cheating individual and claimed that Yvonne should have trusted her instincts about him from the beginning. While the message provided some explanation for what had happened, something about it didn't sit right with Michelle. The timing seemed off, and certain phrases in the email just didn't sound like something her sister would say. Yvonne had never been the type to run off impulsively with someone she barely knew, especially after such a traumatic discovery about Brian's secret child. 3 weeks later, another email arrived from Yvonne, this time saying she was getting homesick and making plans to return home by the second week of January. She mentioned she'd been staying with someone and was looking forward to seeing everyone again. This second email provided some comfort to the family, who assumed Yvonne would show up at their planned family gathering in January. But when that reunion came and went without any sign of Yvonne, Michelle knew something was terribly wrong. Her father, Jim, shared her concerns. After decades of knowing his daughter, he was certain that Yvonne would never simply disappear without maintaining contact with her family. She was too responsible, too caring, and too connected to the people she loved to just vanish into thin air. That's when Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands and investigate further. She reached out to a tech-savvy cousin who could trace the IP addresses of the emails supposedly sent by Yvonne from Panama and Costa Rica. What they discovered would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the dark truth about what really happened on Devil's Island. The cousin's investigation revealed something that sent chills down Michelle's spine. The emails that were supposedly sent from Panama showed IP addresses consistent with that location. But the email claiming Yvonne was in Costa Rica, living with another man, showed an IP address from Dana Point, California, exactly where Brian was now living. This meant that someone had been using Yvonne's email account to impersonate her, sending messages to her family from Brian's computer in the United States. The realization hit Michelle like a sledgehammer. Her sister wasn't hiding out in Costa Rica with some mysterious new boyfriend. Someone had been playing an elaborate game of deception, and that someone was Brian Brimmager. With this damning evidence in hand, Michelle knew she had to act fast. She contacted the FBI, where she met with Special Agent Andrew Masters, a seasoned investigator who immediately recognized the significance of what Michelle had uncovered. The IP address evidence was a smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that foul play was involved. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Yvonne's disappearance, with Masters taking the lead. They contacted the State Department to check immigration records, which confirmed what Yvonne's family had suspected all along. There was no record of her ever leaving Panama or entering Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Yvonne's family couldn't wait for the wheels of justice to turn slowly. They decided to take matters into their own hands and travel to Panama to search for answers themselves. They connected with Don Winner, a legendary investigator and former U.S. intelligence officer who had built a reputation for solving impossible cases in Central America. Winner was known throughout Panama as the person to call when bad things happened to American citizens. He'd already helped put away 3 serial killers and had an uncanny ability to crack the most complex murder cases. When he heard Yvonne's story, he immediately knew they were dealing with something sinister. His assessment was blunt and chilling. The chances that Yvonne was running around Costa Rica with some other man were essentially zero. Winner believed they were looking at a murder case, and Brian Brimmager was their prime suspect. Back in the United States, the FBI was putting pressure on Brian, conducting surveillance and building their case. They discovered that within weeks of Yvonne's disappearance, Brian had not only returned to California, but had gotten engaged and married to Kristen Verkhoven, a woman he'd met while she was working at the White House. The timeline was shocking. Brian had proposed to Kristen just days after Yvonne disappeared in Panama. Wedding photos showed a couple that appeared blissfully happy, completely unaware of the dark secret that lurked beneath Brian's charming exterior. What made this revelation even more disturbing was that Kristen was the mother of Brian's secret child, the very discovery that had allegedly caused the final fight between Brian and Yvonne. Brian had been living a double life, maintaining relationships with 2 women simultaneously, neither fully aware of the other's existence. In Panama, Winner organized a press conference with local authorities to publicize Yvonne's disappearance and put pressure on anyone who might have information. For the first time, Panamanian police officially declared that Yvonne was the victim of foul play and named Brian Brimmager as their primary suspect. The press conference sent shockwaves around the world. Here was a decorated former Marine, someone who had served his country with honor and stood in the White House with the president, now being accused of murdering his girlfriend in a tropical paradise. As news of the case spread, witnesses began coming forward with disturbing accounts of Brian and Yvonne's relationship. Local bar owners and residents described a pattern of verbal and physical abuse that painted a very different picture from the happy couple Yvonne had portrayed in her emails home. One bar owner recalled seeing Yvonne with black eyes and bruises around her face. When asked about her injuries, she tried to hide them and refused to discuss what had happened. The revelation that Brian had been physically abusing Yvonne was devastating for her family, who had no idea she was suffering in silence. Jeff Salzman, who owned one of the local establishments where Brian performed, described him as a scary person who he didn't want to be around. The image of the clean-cut, all-American Marine was crumbling as more and more people shared their experiences with the couple. Yvonne's family organized search parties to comb through the dense jungle and swampland surrounding the island where she'd disappeared. The terrain was brutal. Thick tropical vegetation filled with spiders, snakes, and every kind of dangerous creature imaginable. The water was murky and rancid, making it nearly impossible to see anything beneath the surface, despite the challenging conditions. Volunteers joined the family in their desperate search for any trace of Yvonne. They found various items, a purse, medicine bottles, even a U.S. passport. But none belonged to Yvonne. Each discovery raised hopes only to dash them moments later. The search was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Lauren Beyer, Yvonne's niece, found herself in the heartbreaking position of hoping to find her aunt, while simultaneously dreading what that discovery might look like after so much time had passed. Back in California, the FBI was closing in on Brian Brimmager. Agent Masters had obtained a warrant to search Brian's residence, where he made a crucial discovery. Sitting on a table in Brian's living room was a white Sony Vaio laptop computer, the exact same type of computer that Yvonne had taken with her to Panama. When Masters saw the laptop, he immediately suspected it belonged to Yvonne. His instincts proved correct. The computer contained a wealth of evidence that would ultimately help unravel the mystery of what happened on that remote Caribbean island. The laptop revealed Brian's internet search history, which painted a chilling picture of premeditation. In the days following Yvonne's disappearance, someone had used the computer to search for information about removing blood from mattresses and other incriminating queries that suggested someone was trying to cover up a violent crime. Perhaps most damning of all, the computer contained evidence that Brian had been using Yvonne's email account to send those fake messages to her family. The digital trail clearly showed that the emails claiming she was alive and well in Costa Rica had actually been composed and sent from Brian's residence in California. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Brian had been using Yvonne's debit card to withdraw money from her accounts after her disappearance. ATM surveillance footage captured him making these transactions, providing visual proof that he was accessing her finances while letting her family believe she was safe. As the evidence mounted against him, Brian Brimmager continued to maintain his innocence and live his new life as if nothing had happened. He spent his days playing golf, caring for his young daughter, and enjoying the comfortable suburban lifestyle that his new marriage provided. But the FBI wasn't about to let him escape justice. They were building an airtight case, piece by piece, that would eventually bring him to account for what investigators believed was a carefully planned and executed murder in paradise. In 2013, nearly 2 years after Yvonne had vanished without a trace, the FBI finally made their move. Special Agent Andrew Masters approached Brian Brimmager's apartment with handcuffs in hand, ready to end this elaborate charade once and for all. When Masters knocked on the door, Brian answered and invited him inside, claiming he'd been expecting this visit. For more than 4 hours, while Brian casually babysat his young daughter, Masters grilled him about the inconsistencies in his story and the mounting evidence against him. Brian continued to stick to his original narrative. He insisted that Yvonne had left him for another man, that she'd gone to Costa Rica willingly, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But when confronted with the IP address evidence and the fact that her supposed emails from Costa Rica were actually sent from his computer, Brian began to stumble. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were starting to show in his carefully constructed facade. Masters could see the doubt creeping into Brian's eyes as the evidence piled up against him. But even then, this former Marine refused to break. Brian was arrested and charged with 13 felonies related to the cover-up of Yvonne's death. However, without a body, prosecutors couldn't yet bring murder charges. That would all change in the most dramatic way possible. In June 2013, a local worker clearing brush on the very island where Brian and Yvonne had lived made a discovery that would finally bring closure to this tragic case. Hidden in the dense jungle, just a few hundred yards from where Yvonne's family had spent days searching, he found a duffel bag. When the worker unbuckled the clasp and looked inside, he discovered Yvonne's skeletonized remains. After 2 years in the tropical elements, only bones remained of the vibrant young woman who had come to Panama with such hope and excitement. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. This was Yvonne Baldelli, and her remains told a horrific story of what had really happened in paradise. The autopsy revealed that she had been dismembered, most likely after being stabbed in the back at least twice. The discovery of Yvonne's body allowed prosecutors to finally bring murder charges against Brian Brimmiger. But for Michelle Valenzuela, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her sister, time was running out in her own battle for survival. Michelle had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and doctors gave her just weeks to live. Despite her deteriorating condition, she was determined to see this case through to the end. In what would be one of her final acts of love for her sister, Michelle agreed to give crucial testimony while she still could. The courtroom scene was heartbreaking. Michelle, weakened by cancer but fueled by determination, sat directly across from Brian Brimmiger and told the world about her sister's disappearance. She pointed him out in the courtroom, identifying him as the man who had destroyed her family. The testimony was exhausting, and Michelle collapsed afterward from the strain. But she had accomplished what she set out to do. Her words would be preserved forever, ensuring that Yvonne's story would be told and that justice would prevail. Days later, Michelle passed away, having given everything she had to find the truth about what happened to her beloved sister. Meanwhile, investigators made another breakthrough that would seal Brian's fate. Remember that machete he had sold on Facebook after Yvonne's disappearance? The one he had joked about using to chop up one stripper. The FBI had tracked it down and subjected it to advanced forensic testing. While Brian had cleaned the blade thoroughly, he had missed something crucial. When investigators removed the handle, they found Yvonne's blood and DNA trapped underneath where no amount of cleaning could reach it. This was the smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that this weapon had been used to dismember her body. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Brian Brimmiger's house of lies finally collapsed. His lawyers advised him that fighting these charges would be futile, and in early 2016 he finally admitted defeat. In a dramatic reversal, Brian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. After nearly 5 years of lies, manipulation, and deception, he finally admitted in open court that he had killed Yvonne Baldelli. He offered an apology to her family, but his words rang hollow after everything he had put them through. The judge sentenced Brian Brimmiger to 26 years in federal prison. For a man who had once stood in the White House as an honored Marine, this was a spectacular fall from grace. He would spend the best years of his life behind bars, paying for the terrible crime he committed in paradise. With the case finally resolved, Yvonne's remains were returned to her family for a proper burial. In a touching ceremony, they laid her to rest at sea, knowing that she loved the ocean and would finally be at peace in the waters she had found so beautiful. The case of Devil's Island serves as a chilling reminder that paradise can quickly turn into hell when dangerous people are involved. Yvonne Baldelli went to Panama looking for love and adventure, but instead found herself trapped with a man capable of unthinkable violence. Brian Brimager's ability to live multiple lives simultaneously, decorated Marine, loving husband, and cold-blooded killer, shows how easily predators can hide among us. His wife, Kristen, continues to support him and visit him in prison, apparently still believing in his innocence despite his guilty plea. The real heroes of this story are the family members who never gave up searching for the truth. Michelle Valenzuela's determination to find justice for her sister, even while battling terminal cancer, demonstrates the power of love and persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Today, Brian Brimager sits in federal prison, where he will remain until 2037. The tropical paradise of Panama continues to attract visitors from around the world, but for those who knew Yvonne Baldelli, the islands will forever be haunted by the memory of what happened there. This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding behind the most respectable facades. A military uniform, a charming smile, and an all-American persona can mask the darkest of intentions. And sometimes, what looks like paradise from the outside can be nothing more than Devil's Island in disguise. Imagine living in a place where everyone knows your name, where Friday night football games bring the whole town together, and the biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's apple pie will win first place at the county fair again. A place where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and parents never think twice about letting them walk to school alone. This was Acme, Washington in 1989. A tiny logging community nestled in the shadow of the North Cascade Mountains, where trust wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. The kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and helped their neighbors without being asked. But sometimes, the most peaceful places harbor the darkest secrets. And sometimes, evil finds its way into paradise. On a crisp November morning in 1989, that peace would be shattered forever. A young woman's life would be stolen, a family would be destroyed, and an entire community would discover that safety is just an illusion. This is the story of Mandy Stavik, and the case that haunted a small town for nearly 3 decades. 18-year-old Amanda Stavik was everything you'd want in a daughter. Bright, athletic, ambitious, the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. She'd been the star of her high school basketball team, a cheerleader, and one of the top students in her graduating class. Everyone called her Mandy, and everyone loved her. After graduating from Mount Baker High School, Mandy had headed off to Central Washington University with dreams of becoming a commercial airline pilot. It was an ambitious goal for a young woman in the late 80s, but those who knew Mandy weren't surprised. She'd always been determined to reach for the sky. Thanksgiving weekend 1989 found Mandy back home in Acme, taking a break from her freshman year of college. She was excited to spend time with her family, catch up with old friends, and enjoy the familiar comfort of the place she'd grown up. The day after Thanksgiving, November 24th, dawned clear and cold. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that made you want to get outside and breathe in the mountain air. For Mandy, who'd been a runner throughout high school, it was the perfect morning for a jog. She developed a routine during her years at Mount Baker High. Almost every day, she'd lace up her running shoes, clip a leash on her German Shepherd Kira, and head out onto the rural roads that wound through the countryside around Acme. It was her time to think, to clear her head, and to stay in the kind of shape that had made her such a formidable athlete. That Friday morning was no different. Mandy pulled on her running clothes, said goodbye to her family, and headed out with Kira by her side. She planned to follow her usual route, a path that would take her along Strand Road, past farmhouses and wooded areas, through the heart of the community she called home. It should have been just another run, but Mandy Stavik would never make it home. Hours passed, then more hours. As the afternoon wore on and evening approached, Mandy's family began to worry. She was responsible, reliable, not the type to disappear without explanation. When darkness fell and she still hadn't returned, they knew something was terribly wrong. The search began immediately. Friends, neighbors, family members, everyone who could help, fanned out across the rural roads and forest trails around Acme. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched with flashlights long into the night. Kira, Mandy's faithful German shepherd, had returned home alone earlier that day. The dog was agitated, pacing nervously, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't express. But where was Mandy? For 3 agonizing days, the search continued. Volunteers scoured every inch of the countryside. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats searched the rivers and streams that cut through the landscape. The entire community came together, united in their desperate hope to bring Mandy home safely. But hope turned to horror on November 27th. Detective Ron Peterson was part of the search team that day. He'd been methodically working his way along the South Fork of the Nooksack River in his Zodiac boat when something caught his eye. There, in a quiet side channel away from the main river, he spotted something pink floating in the dark water. It was Mandy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. This wasn't supposed to happen in Acme. This wasn't supposed to happen anywhere, but especially not here, in their safe haven tucked away from the troubles of the wider world. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, a terrifying picture emerged. Mandy hadn't simply had an accident. She hadn't gotten lost or fallen into the river. Someone had deliberately taken her life. The evidence suggested that Mandy had been abducted while out on her run, likely by someone in a vehicle. She was too fast a runner to be caught on foot. Investigators reasoned her attacker had probably used a weapon to force her compliance, then taken her to a location several miles from her jogging route. What happened next was every parent's worst nightmare. Mandy had been sexually assaulted, but she hadn't given up without a fight. Scratches on her arms and legs suggested she'd tried to escape, running through blackberry bushes in a desperate attempt to get away from her attacker. In the end, her efforts weren't enough. Her killer had caught up with her, knocked her unconscious, and then placed her in the river to ensure she wouldn't survive. For Detective Peterson, who had children of his own, the case was deeply personal. As he recovered Mandy's body from the cold water, he whispered words that no parent should ever have to say. The memory of that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation that followed was intense and thorough. Tips poured in from concerned citizens. Police interviewed dozens of potential suspects. They looked at everyone from local drifters to Mandy's own boyfriend, methodically working to rule out each possibility. One early person of interest was David Succi, a transient who'd been seen in the area on the day of Mandy's disappearance. But when investigators obtained his DNA, it didn't match evidence found at the crime scene. In fact, despite collecting DNA samples from 30 different men in the area, investigators came up empty. None of the samples matched. The case that had started with such promise, with physical evidence that should have led directly to the killer, suddenly hit a brick wall as months turned to years. The Mandy Stavik case began to go cold. The detective assigned to it would change. Files would be boxed up and stored away. The daily urgency that had driven the investigation would fade. But the impact on the community never did. In a place like Acme, everyone knew everyone. Mandy's murder didn't just take away a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. It stole something more fundamental, the sense of security that had defined life in this small town. Parents who had never worried about their children playing outside after dark suddenly found themselves checking locks twice before bed. Runners who had felt safe on the rural roads began looking over their shoulders. The easy trust that had been the foundation of community life was replaced by a nagging fear that the killer was still out there, still among them. Years passed, a decade, then another. The case remained officially open, but with each passing year, it seemed less likely that justice would ever be served. Mandy's family never stopped hoping, never stopped asking questions, but even they began to wonder if they would ever know the truth about what happened to their daughter. 25 years would pass before everything changed. 25 years before a casual conversation at a water park would crack the case wide open. 25 years before the people of Acme would finally learn that the monster they'd feared was someone they'd known all along. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Two mothers, sitting on the grass at a local water park, watching their children splash down slides and play in the summer sun. They barely knew each other, these women, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, but they shared a connection that went back decades to their high school years at Mount Baker High. It was June 2013, and somehow the conversation turned to Mandy Stavik. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the water, or the sound of children laughing, that made them think of innocence lost, whatever prompted it. When Mandy's name came up, both women felt something stir inside them, a recognition, a shared suspicion they'd carried in silence for far too long. I just turned to Marilee and said, "Well, I'm sure I know who killed her," Heather would later recall. And she turned to me and said, "Oh, I do too." The name that came from both their lips was Timothy Bass. Tim Bass had been just another face in the halls of Mount Baker High School back in the late 80s. He wasn't particularly memorable, not a star athlete, not a troublemaker, not someone who stood out in any obvious way. He was just there, part of the background of small-town life. But for both Heather and Marilee, Tim Bass had been anything but forgettable. Each woman had experienced encounters with him that had left them deeply unsettled, encounters they'd never spoken about publicly, but had never been able to shake. For Heather, the memory went back to the summer of 1989, just months before Mandy's murder. She was 15 years old, sitting in a friend's truck after a softball game, when Tim Bass, then in his 20s, climbed in beside her. What started as casual conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. He began talking about her eyes, telling her how beautiful they were. Then he picked up a pen from the cup holder and began running it along her knees as she sat there in her cut-off sweatpants. She was just a teenager, trapped in a vehicle with an older man whose attention felt predatory and wrong. I was very nervous. She would remember years later. The incident had stayed with her, a moment of vulnerability and fear that she'd carried in silence. But Marilee's story was even more chilling. It was July 1991, nearly 2 years after Mandy's death. Marilee was at home alone with her young son when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood Tim Bass, claiming he'd been hunting all day and needed to use her phone to call his wife. Something about his presence made her uncomfortable, but she let him in. When she handed him the phone, he dialed a number, but all they heard was the electronic beeping that indicated the call couldn't be completed. The number was disconnected or had never existed at all. Then, Tim's behavior became truly frightening. He walked through her kitchen toward her bedroom, making himself at home in her private space. He told her he used to drive by her house, that he'd always been in love with her, that he wanted to make love to her right then and there. Marilee was terrified. Here was a man who had inserted himself into her home under false pretenses, who was now making sexual advances while her child was nearby. She demanded that he leave, but he refused. Only when she threatened to call the police did he finally go. For more than 20 years, both women had carried these experiences alone, in a small town. Accusing someone of something you couldn't prove was dangerous. Reputations mattered. Families had to live together in the same community. Speaking up without absolute certainty felt impossible. But sitting there in that water park, watching their own children play, they realized they couldn't stay silent any longer. If their suspicions were right, if Tim Bass had killed Mandy Stavik, then their silence was protecting a murderer. They reached out to law enforcement, sharing their stories with Detective Ken Gates, another Mount Baker High graduate who understood the dynamics of their small community. The information was intriguing, but it wasn't evidence. After 24 years, police needed more than suspicions and uncomfortable memories. What they discovered when they began looking into Tim Bass was a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the past quarter century, while Mandy's family grieved and the community lived in fear, Tim Bass had been living a quiet, seemingly normal life just miles from where the murder had taken place. He'd gotten married just 6 weeks after Mandy's death, settled down with his wife Gina, and had 3 children. He worked as a delivery driver for a local bakery, making his rounds through the very communities that had been searching for Mandy's killer. He had no significant criminal record. He kept to himself, went to work, came home. To all outward appearances, he was just another small-town family man living an unremarkable life. But the most shocking discovery was where he'd been living in 1989. Tim Bass's family home sat less than 2 miles from Mandy's house, right along one of her regular jogging routes. If he'd been looking out his window on any given day, he could have watched her run past. He could have learned her patterns, her timing, her routine. When police finally approached Bass in 2013, his behavior immediately raised red flags. Asked about Mandy Stavik, he pretended not to remember her at first. Mandy, he said, as if searching his memory. Oh yeah, she was a girl that they found in the river. Who could forget Mandy Stavik in a community the size of Acme? Her murder had been the defining tragedy of their generation. For someone who'd attended the same high school, lived in the same area, to claim he barely remembered her seemed absurd. When investigators asked Bass for a DNA sample, his refusal was immediate and telling. "I don't want to give my DNA," he said. "I watch those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." His refusal meant police had to get creative. They put Bass under surveillance, following him on his bakery delivery routes, hoping he would discard something that might contain his DNA. Night after night, they watched and waited. But Bass was careful. He threw nothing away that could be tested. The investigation might have stalled there, but Tim Bass had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the people around him, particularly the women who worked alongside him every day. Kim Wagner was Bass's supervisor at the bakery, and she'd never quite felt comfortable around him. There was something off about the way he interacted with people, especially women. He never called her by name, instead referring to her simply as woman. The smallest things would set him off into angry outbursts, making co-workers wary of being around him. When investigators contacted the bakery and Kim realized they were investigating the Mandy Stavik murder, she put 2 and 2 together. They wanted DNA evidence from Tim Bass, and she was in a position to help them get it. For 3 months, Kim watched and waited, every day. She emptied the trash cans to make sure they were clean, hoping Tim would discard a cup or bottle that might contain his saliva. Every day, she watched him carefully, looking for her opportunity. Finally, it came. She saw him throw away a plastic cup, and later a Coke can. Her heart was racing as she retrieved the items, knowing that she might be handling evidence that could solve one of the most notorious crimes in the region's history. She hid the items in her desk drawer until she could turn them over to police. The wait for test results felt endless. But when Detective Kevin Bowie finally got the call from the state crime lab, the words he heard changed everything. "We've got a match." 28 years after Mandy Stavic's murder, police finally had their killer. The arrest of Timothy Bass on December 12, 2017, sent shockwaves through the community that had waited so long for answers. As Detective Bowie placed the handcuffs on the 50-year-old delivery driver in the bakery parking lot, the weight of nearly 3 decades seemed to lift from the shoulders of everyone who had never forgotten Mandy Stavic. But having a suspect and proving guilt in court are two very different things. Bass maintained his innocence, and his defense team was prepared to fight every piece of evidence the prosecution presented. When confronted with the DNA match, Bass's story began to evolve in ways that shocked even seasoned investigators. The man who had initially claimed he barely remembered Mandy suddenly had a very different tale to tell. He now insisted that he and Mandy had been having a secret affair, that their encounter had been consensual. It was a desperate gambit, one that required the jury to believe that an 18-year-old college freshman would have willingly engaged in a relationship with a man she'd never been seen with, never called, never mentioned to family or friends. The defense argued that DNA evidence only proved contact had occurred, not that a crime had been committed. But the prosecution had more than just DNA. They had a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of Timothy Bass. His own family members took the stand against him, describing a man who had shown disturbing attitudes toward women throughout his life. His ex-wife testified about years of controlling, abusive behavior. His brother revealed how Bass had asked him to lie to police, even suggesting they blame their deceased father for the crime. Perhaps most damning was the testimony from Kim Wagner, the brave woman who had helped police obtain the crucial DNA evidence. Her decision to act had been driven by a simple principle: doing what was right for Mandy. The trial lasted 9 days, but the jury's deliberation was mercifully brief. After just 5 hours, they returned with their verdict guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree kidnapping. 29 years and 6 months after Mandy Stavic was found floating in the Nooksack River, justice had finally been served. At his sentencing, Bass continued to proclaim his innocence, but Judge Evan Chaffee was unmoved. He sentenced Bass to nearly 27 years in prison, ensuring that the man who had stolen so much from so many would spend the rest of his meaningful life behind bars. For Mandy's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and continued grief. Her mother, Mary, who had spent decades wondering if she would ever see justice for her daughter, finally had her answer. Her sister, Molly, who had carried the pain of loss for so long, could finally begin to heal. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt by the community of Acme itself. The arrest and conviction of Timothy Bass didn't just solve a murder case, it gave back something that had been stolen from them nearly 30 years earlier. The fear that had shadowed their daily lives, the suspicion that had tainted their interactions, the loss of innocence that had changed their community forever. None of that could be completely undone, but they could finally stop looking over their shoulders. They could finally trust that the monster who had walked among them was where he belonged, The case of Mandy Stavik became more than just a murder investigation. It became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From Detective Bowie, who never gave up on a case that others had written off, to Kim Wagner, who risked her own safety to help catch a killer, to the two mothers at a water park who finally found the courage to speak up. It took a village to bring Timothy Bass to justice. Today, Acme remains a small, close-knit community nestled in the shadow of the mountains. Children still play outside until the streetlights come on. Neighbors still help neighbors. And while the scars of November 1989 will never completely fade, the people of this town have reclaimed something precious, the knowledge that evil may find its way into paradise. But it cannot stay hidden forever. Mandy Stavik was just 18 years old when her life was cut short. But her legacy lives on in the justice that was finally served and in the community that never forgot her name. In the end, love proved stronger than fear, truth more powerful than lies, and justice, though delayed, would not be denied. This was the case no one could forget, and now, finally, no one has to. The voice that counted down America's biggest hits has fallen silent. But the mystery surrounding how and why Casey Kasem died has only grown louder with each passing year. This isn't just another celebrity death story. This is the shocking tale of how one of radio's most beloved voices became the center of a family war so vicious, so filled with accusations of murder and conspiracy, that it would make even the most dramatic soap opera seem tame by comparison. Casey Kasem spent decades bringing joy to millions of listeners every week. His signature countdown show reached over 1,000 radio stations worldwide. His voice brought life to beloved cartoon characters. He was, quite simply, an American icon. But when Casey began his final countdown in 2014, his family wasn't counting musical hits. They were counting money. Lots of it. We're talking about an estate worth somewhere between $80 and $100 million. What happened next would tear apart what should have been a grieving family. Instead of coming together in Casey's final days, his loved ones went to war, and I mean actual war. We're talking about frozen meat being hurled as weapons, secret midnight escapes across state lines, accusations of murder, court battles that continue to this day. The story I'm about to tell you involves a legendary broadcaster, his much younger second wife, his children from his first marriage, and a fortune that would change anyone's life forever. It's a story where everyone claims to be protecting Casey, but their actions suggest something far more sinister might have been at play. By the time you finish watching this investigation, you'll understand why Casey's own daughter would look directly into a camera and say that her stepmother killed her father. You'll see why that same stepmother would fire back with equally shocking accusations. And you'll discover how a man who spent his career bringing families together every Sunday afternoon became the reason his own family may never speak to each other again. This is the story of Casey Kasem's mysterious death, and I promise you, the truth is more disturbing than anything you could imagine. Let me take you back to where it all began. Not to Casey's death, but to the moment when everything started falling apart. The year was 1979. Casey Kasem was already a household name, his radio show reaching millions of Americans every single week. He had been divorced and was raising 3 children from his first marriage when he walked into his agent's office and saw a young secretary named Jean Thompson. Jean was 22 years younger than Casey. She had grown up listening to his voice on Armed Forces radio while living on the Pacific island of Guam. Like millions of other Americans, she knew that voice before she ever knew the man behind it. The attraction was immediate and powerful. Within exactly 1 year, they were married at one of Los Angeles's most luxurious hotels. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Jesse Jackson. 500 guests attended what Jean would later describe as the most incredible day of her life. It seemed like a fairy tale romance. The famous broadcaster and his beautiful bride moved into a stunning mansion in Bel Air, just a stone's throw from the famous Playboy Mansion. Casey was at the absolute peak of his career, and Jean seemed to fit perfectly into his glamorous world. But there was a problem that would eventually grow into something much darker. Casey's 3 children from his first marriage, Carrie, Julie, and Mike, were not exactly thrilled about their father's new wife. Jean claims the children were angry about the marriage from the very beginning. She says they resented her for marrying their father and were upset with Casey for choosing her. The children tell a different story. They say Jean was the one who created problems, gradually driving a wedge between them and their father. For years, this tension simmered beneath the surface. Casey and Jean had their own daughter, Liberty, and the family seemed to function despite the underlying friction. Casey continued his radio career. The couple threw themselves into charity work, and they appeared to live the perfect Hollywood lifestyle. But appearances can be deceiving, and in this family, they were about to become deadly. In 2007, Casey Kasem was 75 years old when doctors delivered devastating news. He was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, a Parkinson's-like disease that would slowly rob him of his mental faculties and eventually his life. The diagnosis changed everything. By 2009, Casey could no longer continue his beloved radio show. He signed off for the final time, ending a career that had spanned decades and touched millions of lives. As Casey's condition worsened, the family dynamics that had been tense for years began to deteriorate rapidly. John claims that around 2012, Casey became fed up with his children's constant requests for money and decided to cut them off financially. She describes them as treating their father like a personal ATM machine, always looking for their next handout. The children tell a completely different story. They say Jean was the one obsessed with money and that she began systematically isolating their father from his own family. They claim she was planning something sinister from the very beginning. According to Jean, what happened next was nothing short of a conspiracy. She alleges that in late 2012, Casey's children lured their confused and medicated father to a UPS store on a lonely stretch of Hollywood Boulevard. She claims they tricked him into signing a document that would give them control over his medical care, effectively cutting her out of any future decisions about her husband's treatment. The children strongly dispute this version of events. They say their father knew exactly what he was doing when he signed that document. They insist he was terrified that John would discover what he had done, and that he wanted to ensure his children could protect him if necessary. This disagreement over a single piece of paper would eventually become the foundation for accusations of murder. As Casey's health continued to decline, the battles between Jean and his children intensified. John claims she was trying to protect her husband from harassment and abuse. The children claim she was isolating their father and preventing them from having any relationship with him at all. The situation became so heated that demonstrations were held outside the family's Bel Air mansion. Police were called multiple times. John says she received threatening phone calls and that her mail was stolen. She claims surveillance vans were parked outside her home, watching her every move. The children say they were simply trying to see their father and that Jean's claims of harassment were elaborate lies designed to keep them away. Both sides were preparing for a legal battle that would determine who had the right to make medical decisions for Casey as his condition worsened. But before that battle could be fought in court, John made a move that would change everything. It was May 7, 2014 at 2:30 in the morning. Casey was staying at a rehabilitation facility in Santa Monica, being treated under a fake name that Jean had provided. Somehow, his children had discovered where he was and had gained access to his room. According to John, she was terrified and furious. She believed her husband's life was in immediate danger, so she made a decision that would haunt this family forever. She ordered Casey's feeding tube and IV disconnected. She checked him out of the facility and loaded him into a black SUV. Then she disappeared into the darkness with her dying husband, and nobody knew where they had gone. The children discovered Casey was missing when they tried to visit him the next day. That's when the real nightmare began. Picture this, one of America's most recognizable voices. A man whose countdown had been a weekly ritual for millions of families was now completely disappeared. His own children had no idea where their dying father had been taken. The media picked up the story immediately. Suddenly, Casey Kasem's mysterious disappearance was making headlines across the country. For days, nobody knew where Casey was. His children made desperate pleas on television, begging anyone who had seen their father to contact police. The situation was becoming more surreal by the hour. How does someone just vanish with a famous radio host who requires round-the-clock medical care? The answer came from an unlikely source. A private investigator working for the children finally tracked down the missing couple. Casey and Jean had been spotted at a luxury resort in Las Vegas, but by the time anyone could get there, they were gone again. What happened next sounds like something out of a Hollywood thriller. Jean had chartered a private jet and flown Casey over 1,000 miles away from Los Angeles, landing in Seattle, Washington. She then drove him to a small town called Silverdale, where he was being cared for in a private home belonging to Jean's childhood friend. Jean later explained that she had taken Casey to Washington to get him away from what she called the madness in Los Angeles. She claimed they were being constantly photographed and followed, that the family was being tortured by the media attention and harassment from Casey's children. But Casey's children saw it differently. They believed Jean had essentially kidnapped their father and was holding him prisoner in a remote location where they couldn't reach him. They immediately went to court to get legal orders that would force John to bring Casey back to California. Meanwhile, in that quiet home in Silverdale, something strange was happening. The woman caring for Casey, a nurse's assistant named Shasta, who had known him for decades, later testified that Casey seemed content and happy. She said he was able to communicate, though only in whispers. Most importantly, she insisted he showed no signs of pain or distress. According to Shasta, Casey was surrounded by Snoopy memorabilia. Apparently, his caregiver's mother was an avid collector, and he seemed to enjoy the peaceful environment. For a brief moment, it appeared that Casey might be spending his final days in relative comfort, away from the legal battles and family drama that had consumed his life. But that peace was about to be shattered in the most bizarre way imaginable. On June 1st, Casey's daughter, Carrie, arrived in Silverdale with a court order demanding that Casey be taken to a local hospital for medical evaluation. She came with lawyers, media crews, and official paperwork that gave her the legal authority to remove her father from the home. Jean was ready for her. What happened next was captured on television news cameras and became one of the most shocking moments in this entire saga. As emergency medical technicians prepared to remove Casey from the house, Jean completely lost control. She started screaming at everyone present, claiming they were frightening her husband and that he didn't want to leave. Casey, confused and disoriented, began crying out that he wanted to stay where he was, but Jean's reaction went far beyond simple protest. She ran into the kitchen, grabbed frozen hamburger meat from the freezer, and came outside wielding it like a weapon. She then began hurling chunks of frozen meat at Carrie and the other people who had come to take Casey away, all while screaming what witnesses described as biblical verses and other incomprehensible statements. The scene was captured on camera and broadcast across the country. America watched in stunned disbelief as the widow of one of the nation's most beloved entertainers literally threw meat at his children while paramedics loaded her husband into an ambulance. Carrie later described the incident as proof that people were seeing the real Jean Kassem for the first time. She claimed this outburst revealed the kind of unstable behavior her family had been dealing with for years behind closed doors. Jean, when asked about the incident later, admitted to throwing the meat but claimed she wasn't crazy. She said the stress of the situation had pushed her to a breaking point and that she was simply trying to protect her husband from people she believed were trying to harm him. Casey was rushed to St. Anthony's Hospital in nearby Gig Harbor, where doctors immediately recognized how seriously ill he had become. The medical team discovered that Casey was suffering from a severe urinary tract infection, a stage 3 ulcer on his back that had eaten almost to the bone, and several other life-threatening conditions. The change in Casey's condition was dramatic and shocking. Carrie later said her father was extremely thin. His face was sunken in, and he looked nothing like the man she remembered. The doctors told her immediately that Casey might not live much longer. Jean tried desperately to get Casey released from the hospital and back into her care. She appeared at the facility with lawyers, claiming that Casey's personal physician had authorized his discharge, but the attending doctors refused to release him, saying he was in too much pain and his condition was too unstable for him to leave the hospital. When Jean was told she couldn't take Casey home, she became hysterical again. Hospital security had to call police to remove her from the building when she refused to leave without her husband. Over the next few days, Casey's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. Multiple doctors examined him and delivered the devastating news that his organs were beginning to shut down. He could no longer digest food properly, and his body was essentially beginning to fail. Casey's children were faced with an impossible decision. Following their doctor's recommendations, they made the agonizing choice to stop their father's artificial nutrition and hydration. It was, they said, the most difficult decision they had ever made, but they believed it was what Casey would have wanted. On June 6th, John was notified that Casey was dying and that she should come to the hospital immediately if she wanted to say goodbye. She and Liberty rushed to Washington, but John later claimed they were only allowed to spend a few minutes with Casey before he died. According to Jean, Casey looked terrified when she saw him for the last time. She said he grabbed her arm and told her he loved her, and she told him the same thing. It would be their final conversation. Jean flew back to California, still hoping to get a court order that would restore Casey's life support. But it was too late. On June 15, 2014, Casey Kassem died surrounded by his children from his first marriage. John and Liberty were not present when he took his final breath. The official cause of death was listed as sepsis resulting from his infected bed ulcer. But for Jean and Casey's children, his death was just the beginning of an even more vicious battle, because now they were fighting not just over Casey's medical care, but over his entire fortune. And the accusations they would make against each other would shock even those who had been following this family's dysfunction for years. Jean immediately accused Casey's children of murdering their father. She claimed they had deliberately hastened his death by cutting off his nutrition and medical care. She insisted that Casey could have lived for years longer if his children hadn't intervened. The children fired back with equally serious allegations. They accused John of elder abuse and negligence. They claimed she had deliberately moved Casey from facility to facility to prevent him from receiving proper medical care. essentially using hospitals as babysitters so she wouldn't have to care for him herself. But the battle was just getting started, because Casey's body was about to embark on one final, utterly bizarre journey that would leave everyone questioning what was really happening in this family. The war over Casey's body was about to reach its most bizarre chapter yet. After Casey died in that Washington hospital, his remains were flown to Seattle and then on to Montreal, Canada. Yes, you heard that right. Montreal. Casey Kasem, the voice of American radio, was sitting on ice in a Canadian morgue while his family battled over where he should be buried. Jean claimed she and Casey had discussed this moment, and that he wanted to be buried in Israel. His children found this absolutely ridiculous. They argued that their father was as American as apple pie, had lived in Los Angeles for 58 years, and would have wanted to be buried there among the people who knew and loved him. But Jean wasn't finished with her international tour of Casey's remains. From Montreal, she arranged for another flight, this time to Norway. Norway, a country Casey had never visited, where Jean had no family connections, and which made absolutely no sense to anyone following this story. In a private ceremony attended only by Jean and Liberty, Casey Kasem was buried in an unmarked grave in Oslo. They brought their own camera crew to document the burial, but to this day, John refuses to explain why she chose Norway, claiming she has concrete reasons but can't share them due to ongoing litigation. The children were devastated and furious. Their father, who had spent his career bringing American families together every Sunday afternoon, was now buried in a foreign country they couldn't easily visit. It felt like Jean's final act of separation, ensuring that even in death, Casey would remain isolated from his children. Meanwhile, the legal battles were escalating beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Both sides sued each other for wrongful death. John accused the children of hastening Casey's death through elder abuse. The children accused John of negligence and claimed her actions directly caused their father's death. The accusations flying between both sides were explosive. Jean maintained that Casey's children had planned his death as part of a long-term plot to inherit his money. She claimed they had chemically restrained him, removed his nutrition, and essentially left him to die in the desert. The children fought back just as hard. They said Jean had systematically isolated their father, moved him from facility to facility without proper medical oversight, and used hospitals as babysitters while she lived her own life. They claimed she had destroyed their father through neglect and manipulation. The financial stakes couldn't have been higher. Casey's estate was worth between $80 and $100 million, and every legal maneuver was costing both sides enormous amounts of money. The beautiful Bel Air mansion where Casey and Jean had lived, their fairy tale life began falling into disrepair. The electricity was shut off, there was no running water, and the property became a symbol of how completely this family had destroyed itself. Court-appointed trustees tried to preserve Casey's memorabilia and belongings, but even this became another battleground. Every photograph, every piece of radio equipment, every personal item became evidence in a war that seemed to have no end. Years passed, and the legal system ground slowly forward. Police departments in multiple states investigated the circumstances of Casey's death. The Los Angeles District Attorney reviewed the case for possible criminal charges. The Gig Harbor Police conducted their own investigation. In the end, every law enforcement agency reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence of homicide. Casey's children had been legally authorized to make medical decisions on his behalf. The doctors who treated Casey confirmed that stopping his artificial nutrition was a standard medical recommendation for someone in his condition. But legal vindication did little to heal the wounds this family had inflicted on each other. The children continued to fight for justice, not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. Carrie started a foundation to pass legislation protecting the visitation rights of adult children, ensuring that other families wouldn't face the same isolation her family had experienced. Today, more than a decade after Casey's death, the legal battles continue. The family members still refuse to speak to each other. Casey's children have never visited his grave in Norway, and John has never returned his body to American soil. Perhaps most tragically, the man who spent his career bringing joy to millions of families every week became the reason his own family may never heal. The voice that once counted down America's biggest hits has been silenced forever, but the echoes of this family's destruction continue to reverberate through courtrooms and headlines. Casey Kasem's final countdown wasn't about music or entertainment. It was about money, power, and the terrible things people will do to each other when both are at stake. His death remains officially classified as natural causes. But the mystery of why this family destroyed itself so completely may never be solved. The man who once told America to keep their feet on the ground and keep reaching for the stars left behind a legacy that proves sometimes the people closest to us can pull us down into the darkest places imaginable. And that's the real tragedy of Casey Kasem's mysterious death. Not that he died, but how his death revealed the worst in the people who claimed to love him most.